there are two options here. You're either basing this on some form of reason. That is, you say, listen, they've never lied to me before. Yep. I understand that this is a rational person. I know who they are. I know what their motives are. And therefore, I conclude that what they're saying is true. I wouldn't call that faith. I'd call that perfectly in line with what the average person would call reason. The other option is that you're doing it, as you describe, on a kind of hunch, an intuition. That is to say, lack of evidence. I would say that what you're describing there is either an instance of believing what they say because you have reason to do so, or believing what you say, or believing what they say despite having no reason to do so on a hunch or an intuition.
Yes, and as has been said before, many a Christian can say, well, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in either, in the sense that often it's a God that neither side really wants to believe in.
Right.
But why do you believe in God, and specifically the Christian God, Bishop Barron? Because perhaps if you could make, if you like, the positive case, and then we'll hear Alex respond to it, and perhaps you can make the case for why he believes atheism makes more sense. This is our central question on the show today: Christianity or atheism, which makes best sense of who we are? How would you respond to that overall question then?
Well, again, we could look at some of the classic ways, Aquinas called them paths. I like that much better than, arguments or, absolutely convincing rational demonstrations. I think ways hits it much more accurately. I think you look at it both sort of protologically, eschatologically. Where does a contingent world come from? Or more precisely, how do you explain contingent states of affairs? The endless appeal to other contingent states of affairs won't work. You must come finally to some non-contingent ground. Now, I'm summarizing that famous argument in just a couple of lines. But something like the quest for a foundation for a world that is radically evanescent, that's radically non-self-explanatory, that exists but doesn't have to exist. Now, that goes back to the beginnings of philosophy, and the earliest philosophers were on that quest. And I think God is a very compelling answer to the question of how to explain contingent states of affairs. But I do it the other way. I'm calling it eschatologically. There's a drive within us, both intellectually and at the level of will, toward what I would call the unconditioned. So the mind is looking for truths all the time, and it finds them, but it's never satisfied. It's one of the great marks of a real intellectual that you're never satisfied with. Every question you answer opens up 100 more questions, and the mind just goes out, out, out. And it's by an inner dynamism pressing toward what I'd call the unconditioned truth, or truth itself. The will seeks the good and finds it in great acts of justice and so on. But it's never satisfied. It keeps opening to wider horizons. God, if you want, is not any of the things in the world that I might find, any of the truths my mind might discover. It's not some good that I might achieve, but a kind of luring horizon for the inner dynamism of the spirit. And I think God is a compelling answer to that, if you want, how to explain the contingency of the world, and then how to explain the inner drive and dynamism of the human spirit. Those are, two kind of classical paths. I want to give Alex a chance to talk. I actually like to say a few words about the ontological argument, because it gets at something that the arguments classically aren't getting at, but I'll leave it there for a second.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back for the ontological argument. Not one we do often on this show, but maybe we can open it up a little. Alex, before we sort of hear your sort of case against God, if you like, what do you think of this particular case for God that Bishop Barron has spelled out?
Well, I agree with many of the implications of what Bishop Barron is saying. I mean, for instance, I very much agree with the idea of an expanse in knowledge essentially never being able to satisfy our curious minds. And there's that image of an expanding circle. As it gets bigger and bigger, so do the edges. The edges, the frontiers of our knowledge get bigger and bigger, such that there are more and more things we don't know. Now, that's one of the things that I find so incredible and beautiful about the scientific and philosophical endeavors that we partake in, because there's just endless things to discover. I find it quite strange how the Christian might be able to say that, yes, our circle is getting bigger and bigger and the frontiers of our knowledge are getting bigger and bigger. But once we get to that certain point, there it is. We've got it. We have the full circle. We know what it is. We're now satisfied. The thing about atheism is that for most atheists that I know, it's more of a passive thing than an active thing. It's more just saying, listen, I'm not the one who has to do the explaining here. I'm perfectly content to say that our knowledge will continually expand, and with it, so will the frontiers. If somebody else comes along and claims that they have the answer, that they have the thing that kind of that cuts off that progress and says we've found the answer, we know what's at the base of all reality, then they better have some good evidence for it. And there are plenty of evidences that are put forward and many arguments that are made, such as the contingency argument, which I've discussed on your show in more detail before, Justin, with Cameron Bertuzzi, of course. The thing about it is that my job as an atheist is essentially to pick holes, rather than to necessarily present an argument to say why it's false. It's more of an undercutting approach than a rebutting approach, is what I like to use. With contingency, when I was on your show before, there's an assumption, for instance, that contingent things exist, which is an assumption that often goes unanalyzed. The idea that actually I could have not been born, or that this glass that I've got on the table here could have been a mug instead, or something like this, is how contingency is often described. But as I spoke about before on your show, Justin, it's not clear that that's necessarily true if, for instance, we live in a deterministic universe where everything is following a causal chain, whereby it actually couldn't have been different. So there are certain assumptions that I think often go unanalyzed in these arguments. And you can have an entire discussion about the nature of contingent objects and whether they exist. But you can also have an entire discussion, if you just grant that they do, and say, is it not the case, as David Hume suggested, that if you have each contingent object explained by another contingent object, you've explained the whole? And there's plenty of discussion to be had there. The problem is that these discussions are so large and so wide-ranging that to say, actually, no, we've solved the problem, we've solved all of these holes that you can pick. We're going to plug them up with God, and not just as a God of the gaps, not just as a, well, we don't really know, let's just say that God did it, but as a kind of, no, this is the best explanation for all of these things. I fail to see it.
Bishop Barron is presenting this like it's a solid explanation, but it's built on assumptions that haven't been proven. He says the universe needs a final cause, but modern physics doesn't actually show that. At the quantum level, events happen without clear causes, and the early universe doesn't behave the way everyday logic expects. Then the argument jumps even further, from something caused the universe to that something is the Christian God. There's no scientific evidence connecting those two ideas. Alex points out the real issue. Atheism isn't claiming to know everything. It's asking for proof from people who say they already have the answer. And right now, there's no measurable, testable evidence for a non-contingent being or a personal God. Even the Bible relies on belief without evidence. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as believing in things not seen.
Response, Bishop Barron, and
Yeah,
we'll go to a quick break.
a couple
But
things.
Firstly, perhaps elaborate a little on that contingency argument, but also this other issue Alex raises where he says it feels to him like Christians are saying, we've got it covered, we've got the ultimate answer, and sort of put a cap really on how far our quest for knowledge can go.
First about contingency, I mean, the word itself, just from, cum tangere, I mean, to touch with. So this state of affairs obtaining right now, that I'm speaking to this machine, which is conveying information to you across the ocean, that light's shining on me right now, this state of affairs is contingent in the measure that it depends upon a set of causes extrinsic to itself. So I put the question of determinism to the side. I mean, we can discuss that separately, but the contingency of this state of affairs is simply the fact that it's being caused by another state of affairs. Now, is that state of affairs itself contingent or non-contingent? If it is contingent, it's explained by some other set of causes. So I don't think look, people in the religious sphere who believed in determinism also accepted the argument from contingency. So I don't think determinism really affects the meaning of contingency. That just means it's being touched upon by some kind of causal agency. Now, can that process proceed to infinity? So I quarrel with Hume there because Aquinas distinguishes between a infinite causal set subordinated what he calls per accidens and subordinated per se. Per accidens would be, you had a father who had a father who had a father, back. In that kind of causal series, that could be infinite because the present existence of the first element is not dependent here and now upon the higher elements. But one subordinated, Aquinas says, per se, is where there's a here and now causal dependency. So the fact that it's not 1,000 degrees in this room right now, the fact that whatever's making those lights go is going, the fact that I have oxygen to breathe, all that's making this state of affairs real. It's actualizing a potential. Well, how do you explain that? Well, that has to be explained through another set of causes, et cetera. That kind of causal series, I'd say Pache, Hume, cannot proceed to infinity because then the suppression of a first element would indeed entail suppression of the subsequent causal elements. So I think that's the kind of causal series that the argument from contingency is quarreling with. Now, let me say a quick thing, too, because I loved your comment, actually, about God and the setting of limits. Because what came to my mind was Augustine's famous dictum, where he said, si comprehendus non est Deus, right? If you understand, that's not God. Which is why we purposely use language like horizon, the sort of like ever retreating. Think of Ignatius of Loyola. God is semper maior, always greater, always more. So you're right. If we were to say, boom, end of it, got it, understand it, got it figured out, that's not God we're talking about. The arguments are kind of gesturing in the direction of this ultimate horizon. But if we become very univocal in our language, si comprehendus non est Deus, or Aquinas, he says whatever can be known or understood is less than God. So if you're tempted to say you're quite right, I got it, end of the argument, that's not God you're talking about. So I would add that observation, which I think is a very valid one that you make.
Just in that last section, Alex, Bishop Robert Barron was responding to that question about whether God is a sort of arbitrary stopping point in as an explanation, and he obviously believes that no, God is in that sense opens up the field rather than closes it down. I mean, I could imagine someone coming back to you and saying, well, a naturalist, someone who is a materialist as an atheist, they've kind of got their stopping point, which is the laws of nature and the material stuff of the world. And that's sort of the boundary of their explanatory viewpoint. And they might equally ask, well, why that particular stopping point? How have you arrived at that particular belief that that's the case? So perhaps take a moment to explain where you do sit on that. Do you call yourself, in that sense, an atheist naturalist or something else? And what makes you confident that atheism or naturalism is indeed the best explanation for the world we live in?
Well, this all very much depends on how we interpret the terms. For example, we were talking about God as being a kind of explanatory stopping point. And you could say the same thing about naturalism if you are a naturalist, if you're someone who believes that the only thing that exists is physical material, essentially. But something like naturalism can also be a methodological process. In other words, as we investigate the world, we make the assumption that there's no supernatural agency at play. So the scientific method, for instance, tends to assume naturalism. It says that we're going to investigate the world only in regards to physical material. Now, that doesn't necessarily commit them to the conclusion that that's all there is. It just means they're using that as a methodology. I would say that in the former sense, in the explanatory sense, I wouldn't call myself a naturalist. I wouldn't make the claim that there's no supernatural dimension to the universe. I couldn't possibly know this. What I can say is that I've seen no evidence to suggest that there is such a thing, and so I kind of abstain from really holding a belief on that position. I remain rather agnostic. But for that reason, I employ a methodological naturalism, which says that I know that the physical world exists, at least to some extent, on most accounts of knowledge that can be made sense of. And so for that reason, when I'm investigating the world, I'll make that assumption. Now, I would have no problem incorporating a non-naturalistic framework into the way I investigate the world if it turns out that there is some reason to think that does exist in the universe. But if you see what I'm saying, whilst I wouldn't assert that I'm a naturalist in the sense that I believe that that's all that there is in the universe, I may employ it methodologically speaking. I would also say, just to respond to what Bishop Barron said a moment ago, because I think it's beautifully put, and one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about causation is that there are two types of causation that can be at play here. When we were talking about causation on your show, Justin, we were talking about causation in the latter sense that Bishop Barron mentioned, like I was caused by my parents caused by their parents. But as Bishop Barron implies, there is another type of causation, which is a more kind of simultaneous causation. The thing about parentage is that if my parents cause me, if my parents then go away, then die or whatever, I'm still here, right? But there's another kind of causation, this kind of hierarchical causation, as Ed Feser describes it, which is the kind of causation that says that the laptop I'm speaking to you on is being held up by a table, and the table is being held up by the ground. Now, if you get rid of the table, the computer doesn't stay where it is, right? The computer being caused to be where it is as it is. It's being caused by the table, but not in such a way like with my parents, where if you took it away, it then disappeared. It would still be here. But rather, if you take that away, it completely disappears. The interesting implication of this is that when we talk about a cause and a cause and a cause and a cause and a chain of causation, that's not what we should be describing, because the intermediate steps actually have no causal power of their own, right? The table only has causal power to hold up the computer insofar as the ground gives it that causal power, because if the ground takes that away, the table doesn't have that causal power on its own. And so the very language that we speak about these things in, when we say, well, actually, there's this kind of causation which works hierarchically speaking, right? I'm not sure that that's entirely accurate because of the fact that we're not really talking about causes here. We're kind of talking about an intermediary stage of things which don't have any causal power of their own accord. The crucial question there is then, what gives this entire chain of contingent things its causal power as one block? That's the question that needs to be discussed. And the Christian says that it's God. The atheist might say that it's the necessity of the chain itself, or perhaps the necessity of the universe or something like that. But talking about causation in that manner, I think, is ill-advised. But I would recommend to people who are listening, who want an accessible version to understand this kind of causation that isn't the kind apparent in the Kalam cosmological argument, a cause before an effect kind of thing, but this different, slightly less intuitive form of causation. I'd certainly recommend reading Ed Feser's book, 5 Proofs of the Existence of God, on that topic. But I just wanted to make that observation before moving on completely.
There's a bigger problem here that keeps getting ignored. Christianity makes very specific claims about reality, and those claims don't match the evidence. The universe is about 13.8 billion years old, based on cosmic background radiation and expansion data. Life evolved over billions of years through natural selection. There's no point in that process where a supernatural being is required. Then look at the Bible itself. Genesis describes a creation order that conflicts with science. Plants before the sun, humans created separately from animals. In Mark 16:17 to 18, believers are told they can handle snakes and not be harmed. That doesn't hold up in reality. And across religions, there are thousands of different gods, all claimed with the same confidence. They can't all be true. That tells you belief is shaped by culture, not evidence. So this isn't just about not knowing. The claims have been made, and when you test them against science, history, and reality, they don't hold up.
Sure. Did you want to add anything to that, Bishop Robert Barron?
Well, simply this, that I wouldn't use the language of the intermediary elements not having causal efficacy. It's a borrowed causal efficacy. Just as the state of affairs obtaining now exists, but doesn't have to exist. It doesn't contain within itself the reason for its own subsistence. And so it's a borrowed subsistence, if you want. And the same is true of all the elements within the chain. They are truly causes, but their causality is borrowed, or they're actualized by a higher and higher chain. But the important thing is, whatever we want to call that, it has to be grounded somewhere, or else we can't explain the state of affairs in front of us that needs to be explained. As you say, the computer resting on the table. We can't explain what obtains now if we simply infinitely postpone the explanation, which is what's implicit in a infinite causal series of that type. Now,
Yes.
now Aquinas will say, and this all people call God. I'm happy for the moment to say, let's just stop there. And there's got to be something like a non-contingent source of contingency. And now by several other steps, I think we can get to something that really resembles what's classically characterized as God, but that's a second or third move.
Yeah, now that's why in these discussions, and in fact, I would still quarrel slightly with what you're saying in the sense of the terminology of borrowed causal efficacy, in the idea that the table does have causal power, that it's borrowing from the ground, that kind of thing. I'm imagining an analogy that's often used to describe this kind of causation is that of a paintbrush, and the idea of a kind of infinite paintbrush somehow painting a picture. That wouldn't make any sense. I would say if you had a painter who is painting an image, I don't think it would make sense to say that the paintbrush itself has artistic efficacy, that it's borrowing from the painter. I'd say if the painter puts the paintbrush to paper, it's the painter that has that efficacy, that has that artistic efficacy, and through the paintbrush, which has none of that efficacy itself, it's getting to the paper. In the same way, I would say that whatever kind of causes are naturally sustaining another thing's ability to create or to withhold or to sustain something. I think it does make sense to say that actually no, it doesn't have causal power if its entire ability to do that causation comes completely from something else, which is giving it that power in the same way that the painter gives the paintbrush artistic efficacy. I don't think you would use that kind of language.
No, you're equivocating there, though, because you don't give the paintbrush as such aesthetic efficacy. It has the efficacy to put color on canvas. It's got that kind of efficacy. I just use Platonic language there, participation. You've got a kind of participated causality. All of it, quite right, is grounded in the supreme causality of God. It wouldn't, like Aquinas talks about the being given the privilege of participating in God's causality. So the way that we share in God's providence, God is providential over all things, but I can participate in that causality. Material things do it unconsciously. We can do it through conscious cooperation. But I don't know. To me, though, whatever we want to call that, it wouldn't really affect the argument that we have to come to some first instance.
What I'd love to move on to at this point, and again, there's a great conversation on the contingency argument you can find on the Unbelievable channel elsewhere, but is, in a sense, the question of, well, presumably, Bishop Barron, you're not a Christian, you're not a Catholic just because of some great arguments that Aquinas made a century, a millennia and a half ago or whatever.
Right.
So what's the what for you is faith? Presumably, it's more than just those intellectual arguments that obviously have been part of your journey along the way.
Let me start with a very quick little anecdote. I don't know if you, over in the UK, you know Bill Maher's program. He's a very well-known kind of left-wing political and cultural commentator, fiercely atheist, hates religion. Well, one time he had a Christian on his show who was a political lobbyist. So they talked politics for a time. But then he said to him, "Now you're a man of faith." And he said, "Yes. That means you accept all kinds of things on the basis of no evidence." And the man said, "Yes." Well, I had the channel switcher in my hand, and I threw it at the camera, at the TV, because I thought, no, man, that's the whole problem. Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, said faith is the most misunderstood word in the religious lexicon because it's construed just that way. Faith means some wild credulity, some crazy superstition, believing any old nonsense on the basis of nothing. That's not what faith is in our great people. That's not what faith is in Thomas Aquinas or Anselm or Augustine or any of the great figures. To put it simply, faith is never infra-rational. So superstition, gullibility, accepting any old nonsense, that's all infra-rational. I'm against that. The church is against that. That's superstitious nonsense. Faith, authentically construed, is always supra-rational. It's a surrender at the far side of reason. I think that the best analogy to it is in our coming to know a person, right? So I'm meeting both of you, at least virtually now for the first time. I watched videos of you. My mind was alive to see what you're like and listen to you talk, and I drew conclusions and so on. I hope someday I can meet you in person. I'll have an even more thorough knowledge of you. My mind will be fully engaged around that. But I mean, let's suppose we continued to get to know each other and we developed into real friends. Well, my mind has never gone to sleep in this process. My mind is still alive and awake and alert and studying. But at some point in that friendship, you would reveal something to me that I could never have learned through my own reason, by reading about you or even talking to you or talking to others about you. You'd speak some truth about your life that I could never have guessed unless you had told me. And see, at that point, I have to make a decision whether I believe you or not. You could be making some crazy stuff up, I don't know, or you could be telling me the deepest truth of your heart. I have to decide at that point, do I believe you? Now, I haven't put reason to sleep at all. At no point in this process have I set reason aside. But at a key moment, if I really want to get to know you, I have to say, yeah, based on a lot of things and hunches and intuitions and experience and knowledge and what I've gathered about this person, I'm willing to say, yes, I believe that truth about you. That's an analogy, it seems to me, to religious faith, authentically construed, that we would hold, and we could talk about what this means. It doesn't mean voices coming out of clouds. That God speaks. If I accept things on the basis of no reason or no argument, just any old nonsense, that's credulity and superstition. But a surrender on the far side of reason to the self-revealing God, that's faith authentically construed, I think.
Well, I mean, look, I would put it rather plainly and say that with the proposition you put forward is quite a simple one. You know, someone you know puts forward a piece of information and you've got to decide whether to trust them or not. There are two options here. You're either basing this on some form of reason. That is, you say, listen, they've never lied to me before. Yep. I understand that this is a rational person. I know who they are. I know what their motives are. And therefore, I conclude that what they're saying is true. I wouldn't call that faith. I'd call that perfectly in line with what the average person would call reason. The other option is that you're doing it, as you describe, on a kind of hunch, an intuition. That is to say, lack of evidence. I would say that what you're describing there is either an instance of believing what they say because you have reason to do so, or believing what you say, or believing what they say despite having no reason to do so on a hunch or an intuition. If it's the first, then I'd just call it reason, and if it's the second, then I'm supposing you wouldn't call it faith.
This right here exposes the core problem with Christianity. They try to redefine faith to make it sound rational, but when you break it down, it doesn't hold up. Either you believe something because there's evidence, that's reason, or you believe it without evidence, that's not reason. And Christianity depends on that second one. There is no verified evidence for miracles, no repeatable proof of divine intervention, no measurable presence of a personal God. Every major claim, resurrection, answered prayers, divine revelation, fails scientific testing or relies on ancient texts written decades after events. So when Justin and Bishop Barron try to dress faith up with philosophy, it doesn't change what's happening. It's still belief without evidence. And once you strip away the language, it becomes clear. This isn't knowledge, it's trust based on assumption. That's why this matters. Because if a belief system asks you to accept claims without evidence, it can justify anything. So now the question is simple. Are beliefs about reality based on evidence, or are they based on faith without proof? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Where do you stand on this? If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more. And this is only part 2. If you want the full context and deeper breakdown, go watch the rest of the conversation.